And we are very proud of that standard because it sort of laid the groundwork for most of the other standards that we've been producing since. And at the GM in Pretoria in 2012, another significant development happened. Namely, we've agreed to develop several specialist translation and interpreting standards. Because previously we were more focused on laying the groundwork for sort of generic standards. So after we made the decision to go for some specialist translation standards, work on interpreting standards, obviously, work on the legal interpreting requirements standard, that's ISO 228, began in 2014, and then the standard was published in 2019. I'm mentioning this standard because it's sometimes treated as a sort of a parallel standard to the one I'm going to be talking about today. On the one hand, it is, because it is legal interpreting requirements. But if you put those standards next to each other, you would see that the legal interpreting requirements standard is much more generic. It's much more focused on the role and function of legal interpreting, rather than focusing on strict requirements. So in that sense, ISO 27771, which we started on in 2015, and it was published in 2020, it's more sort of a strict standard which has a better, I would say, certification potential. So that's the main sort of difference. So it's a sort of a brother and sister relationship, but it's not exactly parallel. So what is included in ISO 27771? This is more or less the structure of the standard. So some of those elements are a standard for every single standard. I know it sounds funny, but even standards are standardized, especially ISO standards are standardized in many ways. So every single ISO standard that you might come across will have a section which will be called introduction, scope, and terms and definitions usually, and annexes, for example. So in this standard, traditionally, you have the introduction, then you have the scope, then you have key terminology and definitions, then you have some sort of a general introductory clause. So we call them clauses nowadays. They used to be sections in the past. And then you have, in this case, two of the most important sections for this standard, which is the competencies and the qualifications sections, or clauses, as they say nowadays. And then you have the translation process section, where it's described step by step. And we try to address all of the issues that are part of the translation process. And then we added a lot of stuff that's never been done before. We added a lot of issues like confidentiality, security, professional liability insurance. And those are the interesting bits because they had to finally be put on paper somewhere. And this is the standard where we've done it. And then we have a very interesting section yet, the professional development section, where we talk about continuing professional development and translators' involvement in the industry at large. In other words, conferences, continuing education activities, being part of associations, that sort of thing. And then we've got the annexes. In this case, we've only got 3 annexes, A to C. So that's the general structure. And now let's go to the introduction and scope. The introduction section, like in most standards, in this standard is purely informative. That basically means that it's not normative. It's informative as opposed to normative, means that it tells you about what the standard is about and why it was produced, but it doesn't try to set requirements at this stage. That starts happening from the scope onwards. So this standard covers law-related or legal specialist field translation. We call it that because we had a little bit of a linguistic issue. What happens is, a standard is called legal translation standard, and it sounds really great in English. That's fine. When we say legal translation, we understand it very broadly to mean legal translation, translation in legal settings, translation that has some component of law or the framework of law, whatever. So that's fine in English. But what happens in many languages is that you can't really use just one term to define this whole area. So, for example, if you look at the French version of the standard, or at least the French title of the standard, it won't be legal translation requirements. There will be two things here. That's traduction. Pardon my pronunciation. It's not great anymore. Traduction juridique et judiciaire. So, in other words, there are two concepts that cover the same sort of area. In Polish, you'll have the same thing. You'll have tłumaczenia prawnicze I prawne, which basically also covers this law-related, legal field, context, specialization, whatever. So that's why in the introduction and the general section, we tried to sort of describe the whole area that we are trying to cover with this standard. And we are trying to use many more words. Because we also identify a legal translation as one of the most sensitive types of translation, because of the potential legal consequences, because the formal and liability issues involved are really, first of all, numerous, and secondly, they are really difficult to handle in many cases. We have all agreed, I mean, all of the experts that worked on the standards, all of the committees that voted on the standards, we agreed that legal translation requirements require very specific competencies and qualifications and an extremely professional approach from translators. So due to this formalized, official, and sensitive nature of the subject matter, we also recognize that in some countries, settings, and under certain circumstances, legal translation is subject. What I say here is maybe subject, but it really is subject to specific professional and confidentiality requirements. And for example, there are sort of there are certain types of translation that will be referred to as, for example, authorized translation. I sort of hesitate to say this here because that's the term we finally agreed on. But we had a lot of discussions on this because in many countries, as many countries as there are in the world, you will have different terms for this. So in the end, we had to agree on authorized translation because certified translation might mean something completely different. For example, in many countries, certification might be granted to translators that are not authorized officially as we would in some countries understand it. For example, in Poland, Austria, Germany, I think in Romania as well. What happens is you have officially authorized translators who performed translation on behalf of usually judicial organs or institutions, and that's where they are sort of governed by legal rules and regulations and whatever. So in the end, as I said, we agreed on authorized, but there's also a whole body of translation types which could be referred to as certified, and also some translators would have security clearance, some wouldn't, of course. So we had to address all these issues, and we discussed this in the general section in order to clarify some of those concepts. And having said this previously, we all agreed that legal translation services should be provided by competent translators who have the professional understanding of the relevant legal systems, legal terminology, target language, genre conventions, and they can produce what we refer to in the legal translation field of specialization as authentic texts. In other words, texts that can actually have legal significance and can be treated as on par with the original. And in other words, those translators have to meet a lot of competence requirements apart from the qualifications, and they need those professional quality benchmarks in order to be able to say or satisfy certain requirements and prove to the general public and to their clients that they are top-notch translators, for want of a better word. So ISO 27701 was developed in response to this evident market need for this sort of a specialist standard. And it was this sort of standard was developed first because we thought, and I think we were right, that it will be, or it was maybe the most difficult one, the most strict one that we had to develop. If we go on, it hasn't been agreed yet, but if we go on with this strategy of developing specialist standards for other fields of specialization, for example, technical, medical, whatever, I think they will be much easier. First of all, because the structure and the issues sorted out in this standard allow for that. And secondly, because none of those specializations require such strict adherence to rules and such high qualifications. So this is, and one more thing that we already state this in the introduction, but it keeps being repeated several times in the standard, because it's very important to understand that this standard was intended for implementation by individual translators who actually specialize in the provision of legal translation services. It doesn't mean they can't specialize in something else as well, but if they want to operate or work according to this standard, or if they want to certify against this standard, then they obviously have to be individuals. And this is crucial, because I've already had a lot of questions about translation companies certifying against the standard. Well, if we are strictly within the boundaries of what this standard does, then it's impossible. You have to be actually an individual translator. So the scope, as I said, is sometimes more normative. In other words, it already says what some requirements will be. And basically what it has to say is what a standard does and what it does not do, at least if it's properly written. I mean, you'll come across a lot of scopes that I would consider not very specific, let's say, rather vague. But if a standard is written properly, then by reading the scope, you should be able to very clearly understand what the standard does and what it does not do. In other words, what are the exceptions or what it does not cover. So what ISO 27701 does is it specifies the requirements for the competencies and qualifications of translators, revisers, and reviewers. It also sets a lot of best translation practices. It discusses in detail, step by step, the translation process affecting the quality and delivery of legal translation services by individual translators mainly, although there is a component where I will mention this later, where it discusses a situation where a legal translator, an individual, works with either with a direct client or with an intermediary. In other words, a translation company, which we refer to in the ISO context as TSPs, that's translation service providers, because under that heading, you will have a lot of different types of translation service providers. So anyway, we discussed this later on. And another thing that ISO 27701 does is it also sort of describes which requirements have to be fulfilled and how the individual legal translator has to demonstrate their conformity to this standard. And of course, it's understood that if they demonstrate conformity to this standard, it also demonstrates their capability to maintain a level of quality in legal translation services that will meet the clients and other applicable specifications. This is quite important because we distinguish very clearly between what are the client's needs and what are other applicable specifications. For example, you can imagine that a client might have a certain set of requirements or set a certain level, or even require according to his specification, which is also sometimes referred to as the translation brief in the context of individual translators. But for example, there is a general rule where you have to also stick to certain terminology because that's what a legal context requires. And independent of whether the client tells you, oh, just do it quickly and whatever will do, you still have to stick to what is another applicable specification. So that's what that term means within the standard. So the scope also tells you what ISO 27771 does not do. And basically, to keep things simple, there are two things that it does not do. One is that we stated clearly that the use of output from machine translation, even with post-editing, is outside the scope of the standard. In other words, what we meant by this is that if you sit down and you process your content through some sort of a machine translation engine, and then you just sit down and start post-editing it, that doesn't work for legal translation, or it might work for legal translation somewhere, but it will not work for this standard. This standard does not cover it. It's outside the scope. In other words, it means that if you're doing this, you're not working according to this standard. But there is a caveat here because nowadays, I think most of you know, we operate in what could be referred to as augmented translator reality. In other words, what the translator does normally is that they work in some sort of an environment and they use tools. It could be CAD tools, it could be some sort of, different setup, but they use systems. And even lawyers use special systems special. They're not special in themselves, but they are designed for lawyers in order to deal with certain types of legal documents. And sometimes translators also have to work in those systems. So in other words, whether it's a CAD tool or another type of tool of that sort, what could happen is you might be getting within that tool some prompts from machine translation. If you're getting prompts or suggestions, you use it as a reference in order to work faster, for example, that is not something wrong, and you're still working according to this standard. What you cannot do is just process your content using machine translation engines. That's what you cannot do. And there are also other reasons why it shouldn't be done for legal translation. Some of them are related to security. So some of them are related to personal data protection. I mean, there's no point going into that, but this is what it means, that it's outside the standard. So another thing that the standard clearly says it does not deal with is it says that it does not apply to interpreting services. This seems very simplistic because, I mean, it's obvious. If it's translation, legal translation, that it's not, then it's not interpreting. But believe it or not, there are a lot of people that keep mixing all this up. And it has to be stated clearly within the scope, otherwise it leads to confusion. So that's the scope. And then we go again to the clauses that that are part of the structure. And the next clause, logically, usually it's the terms and definitions clause. So the terms and definitions sometimes tell you more about the standard than just a quick, perusal of the standard. And in this case, there are lots of terms and definitions, and some of them are very original. So I would really recommend looking at them. The terminology section includes certain categories under which we have classified the terms and the definitions. So we have concepts relating to legal translation and legal translation services. And those include, for example, those key definitions. And I only mentioned two here because we don't have the time to go too much into it. So here you would find concepts like legal translation or what is specialized translation. I just gave those examples here to show you that when in the ISO context, you look at this clause, the terms and definitions clause, and you see the definitions written like this: law or legal specialized translation, and then you see something in the brackets, and translation, for example, is italicized. That means that this term is also defined under 314. And sometimes those definitions are a bit funny because they can be very brief, but actually in order to understand this definition, you have to go to all of those sections to put it apart again. But this is the typical format. Sorry for that. And the second section here would be concepts related to translation workflow, technology, and project management. And then we'd have concepts related to language and content. And then we have concepts related to the people involved in translation services. Of course, here you'd be dealing with terms and definitions for the specialist translator, for the legal translator, and as I mentioned before, for the authorized legal translator. And another one, which is really important, has also never been defined anywhere, just like the authorized legal translator, that's the lawyer linguist. It's not a very popular profession yet, but I think it's one of those important future professions, and it was clearly important to define it here. Especially as you will see later on that by defining it here, we also sorted out a certain problem with the qualifications of legal translators. Concepts related to the translation process, resources, and professional requirements are the next section. And that's, for example, translation certification, the non-disclosure agreements, the service level agreements, also called SLAs, and the continuing professional development. And as part of the continuing professional development, in this standard, you have a scheme which shows you how this can be implemented, I mean CPD, by using continuing education points, which is which actually is part of the European qualifications framework, and it works very well with any academic programs or any programs structured according to those rules. I'll go to that later if we have the time, because it's another interesting section. So altogether, there are 51 terms defined in ISO 27771. And as I mentioned before, I think this is a very important resource in itself, because some of them have never been defined anywhere before. And some of the definitions are very clear. They sort out a lot of previous discussions on those subjects. And I think once we came and we reached consensus on those definitions, we really made a step forward. The next clause is the general clause. And in the general clause, we have once again sort of recouped what was said in the introduction and sort of developed it. We basically introduce the reader of the standard to legal translation and all the issues that are involved. And we clarify here the distinction between legal translation in general and authorized legal translation, because there was a lot of worry around this. In countries where authorized legal translation is extremely regulated, let's say, there was this fear that because of the standard, somehow this category of authorized legal translation translators will become sort of watered down within all of those concepts. So we have clearly stated here what is sort of general or generic legal translation and what happens when it's done by an authorized legal translator. So we've said here that authorized legal translation refers to this specialized translation category, let's say, performed by officially authorized legal translators. And we mention what happens in some countries or regions. And we also mentioned that in some countries they could be referred to under, well, basically a number of terms. You could call them court translators, court appointed translators, sworn translators, court authorized translators, or certified legal translators. But certified legal translators could mean basically different things to different people. So this one is always a sort of a debatable term, the certified legal translator term. And basically what happens here, we stated that those certified translation, here it says output. I can't remember whether we actually said output or documents, but basically we said that those are those documents that performed by or produced by authorized legal translators that have the status of officially recognized documents. And the next very important section is the competency section. So what I should be actually doing is discussing the individual competencies, but it's impossible because we don't have enough time. So what I'm going to just say here is that this section is very similar in many ways to the 17100 section, because those standards are supposed to be complementary in many ways. But all of those headings for the descriptors for competence are basically focused on legal translation field of specialization. So if in 17100, for instance, you'd have translation competence described as the, I don't know, competence of, or rather the ability of being able to translate from your, I don't know, B language to A language or C language to A language or whatever. Here, the focus would be on being able to produce or translate legal documents. And the linguistic and textual competence in the source language and the target language would focus on the same. It would be about the relevant language pairs, and it will be about legal translation. And the specialist legal field competence, for example, will cover knowledge of different legal systems. If you're working if you're working in languages where you have to deal with, for example, common law context and what we call continental law, which is mainly European continental sort of framework, then obviously you really need to understand what those contexts mean. You have to understand the system, like common law system, which is, for example, the UK and the old colonies, for example. A lot of the American legal concepts and rules relate to the old common law sort of background. So you have to be able to move between those legal systems. And this is what the specialist legal field competence is all about. Also, you have to have competence in research, information acquisition, and processing. But naturally, in this case, you have to be able to research legal documents. You have to be able to use legal documents as references, and you have to understand how, for example, legal documents are structured. And then you have the legal culture competence, which is a little bit like specialist legal field competence, except in the special legal field competence, it's more about the genre conventions that are associated with specific systems, for example, and specific language conventions. But in legal culture competence, it's more about the systems and understanding how different concepts might be referred to in different cultures because of, for example, changes that are happening. Because For example, you have a lot of issues nowadays around the way people refer to themselves, the way, for example, for the purpose of being very gender, let's say gender unspecific. You suddenly have to, for example, as we had to introduce in ISO, we refer to people as they, even if they're an individual. For example, in ISO standards nowadays, we've changed the editorial rules, and you will have a person, and then suddenly you will start talking about them as they, because you don't want to identify them by their, gender. You don't want to say it's a she or a he. So those are the changes that you have to be aware of if you are a translator, and you have to be aware of where